talk a little bit about how counterproductive our policies have been and how those policies have really played to the advantage of this Ayatollah, the Ayatollah-led regime?
No, you're absolutely right, and you're putting your finger on something very important that goes to explain why you had 5% support for military strikes 10 years ago, and then suddenly a strong minority in the community, above 45%, but not 50, that in the beginning of this war were in favor of it. Obviously, the fundamental factor is the repression of the Iranian government itself that has intensified. But the question is, why has it intensified? And here the sanctions come in as a very important factor. Between 2016 and 2017, when the JCPOA was in effect and the US had lifted or at least waived its sanctions, the Iranian economy grew 6 to 7% every year. The middle class was getting stronger. And if this had continued for another 10 years, if the US had never walked out of the JCPOA and sanctions had remained
This is just for people
lifted,
who don't know. This is the Obama,
correct.
the agreement, which freed up, I think, billions. You probably know the exact figure of Iranian frozen assets.
Correct. Frozen assets were freed up, but more importantly, the Iranians were able to sell oil again. Investments could be flowing in. It didn't happen to the extent that the Iranians hoped for. But nevertheless, even in that limited sense, their economy grew 6 to 7%. If that had continued, economists have made calculations, Iran's middle class would have become the strongest, if not or one of the strongest middle classes in the Middle East by 2025, 10 years after the signing of the JCPOA. This would then have led to a scenario in which the Iranian middle class, as in all other middle classes, would be exerting pressure on their government for greater openness, political liberalization, same trends that we have seen in other places. But they would be doing so from a position of strength, because the growing economy would have reduced the state's ability to control all means of production and assets and income in the country. Instead, Trump walked out of the JCPOA, imposed even stricter sanctions on Iran, which then decimated the Iranian middle class. Between 2018 and 2019, 1/3 of Iran's middle class actually went into poverty as a direct result of the sanctions. This then predictably led to an even more repressive Iranian government who had to use more repression in order to be able to sustain their own power in the country as the economy was deteriorating further. Then we saw the massive protests in 2022 around Masa Amini, and of course the protest earlier in December and January, in which the government was using more and more repressive means, and in January killing several thousand protesters. And what you saw there is that as a result of this increased repression, which to a large extent has to do with the economic situation, which has very much to do with the sanctions being reimposed, is that the population also then in reaction became radicalized. In 2009, they were protesting in favor of making sure that the election results would stand, that there wouldn't be any election fraud. But it was about change within the system. By 2022, there was no demand for reform. It was a demand for the regime to fall altogether. And the means for that was street protest and revolution. By 2025, 26, the demands that we were increasingly hearing from the protesters was, again, no reform, just get rid of this regime. But now suddenly, at least a portion of the protesters, a minority, but nevertheless, started asking for military intervention from the outside. The argument being that the population no longer is in a position to overthrow the government on its own. It has to have military intervention. So you had these protests again occurring, of course, but instead of being from a position of strength, as they could have been had the sanctions been lifted, now people were out there out of desperation and despair, protesting from a position of weakness. And I think this is a very important lesson for us to understand, because yes, sanctions can destroy and devastate the economies of these countries, but we have almost no examples in which the sanctions lead to successful protest movements that overthrow the government. More protests, but less successful protests, and more desperate protests. That's exactly the pattern that we have seen here, and it tells us how counterproductive US policy has been if we assume that the goal actually has been to see Iran move in a more liberal and democratic direction.
Now, the U.S. government has admitted to also arming factions within Iran. Can you speak about that?
Yeah, so we had Trump himself reveal it to a Fox News reporter that the U.S. had been sending arms to the Kurdish rebels in Iran. And on top of that, of course, we saw how both the Israelis were saying that they were on the ground, how we saw the former head of the CIA, Mike Pompeo, saying that the Mossad and others are on the ground and that armament, etc., have been shipped. I think what is emerging here with these revelations or admissions is that the protests in December and January were overwhelmingly peaceful, and they were overwhelmingly by people who just came out of their frustration and anger at the repression and mismanagement of the economy by the Iranian government. But there were also elements there who operated under the shadow of these protesters, who the protesters had no relationship with and did not know about, who were armed and trained by Israel or the United States, who used extensive violence, burning banks, burning mosques, burning fire stations, killing a lot of police and other members of the Basij, for instance, which is something we had
I
not
just want to
seen
interrupt
in
you.
the
The
past.
Basij are these popular militias,
The popular militias,
for people who
exactly,
don't know.
which are used by the government to repress the population.
Right.
But, despite the fact that they are, of course, extremely unpopular, we had not seen this level of violence from protesters before. The 2009 protesters were extensively peaceful with a very strong nonviolent discipline. A person I spoke to who has essentially attended all protests in Iran since 2009 said that in 2009, if anyone started using violence or throwing stones at shops, etc., other protesters would intervene to keep a nonviolent discipline. This time around, he said he was out protesting in January, but then he saw people dressed in black that seemed to move very coordinated, planned way, using violence, and he saw no one intervening because people were as afraid of those violent elements as they were of the repressive representatives of the state. And this is a phenomenon we had not seen before in Iran in the last 40 years or so. And again, when Trump is coming out and saying, hey, we armed these people, it frankly makes sense. The picture is starting to become complete.
Well, and those armed attacks became the excuse for wholesale slaughter. We don't really know. I mean, 7,000 Iranians killed in the streets, maybe more, but they became the excuse to gun people down en masse.
Yeah, the Iranian government essentially started gunning people down en masse, not making a distinction between peaceful, legitimate protesters and others who have been trained and armed by foreign services. And as a result, you had, frankly, a massacre. Some people are throwing out the number 30,000, 40,000, etc. See no evidence for that, but reality is there is evidence for around 7,000, and 7,000 people killed is a ridiculous and horrific number of people killed by the Iranian government in just 2 days. And that tells you something. It tells you how bad the situation was, how perhaps desperate even the Iranian government was, thinking that it was losing control and then allowed its militias to just use violence in an indiscriminate manner.